mentioned the story of hearing, you were sharing with these Chinese brothers the persecution that those who have come to Christ, the Muslim background believers, have encountered. And you woke up, you went to bed that night. You said you were tired, you were done. And you woke up the next morning to really a loud noise. Describe that whole situation, if you will, because it's phenomenal.
The bamboo curtain around East Asia, China, is as strong as any, what we used to call about the Iron Curtain of the Soviet Union. And nothing got in and out of there from the Cultural Revolution in 48. I remember reading an article in 1983 that as China was beginning to open up, were we going to get, would we find any churches left alive and any believers left alive? And when we got back in there, we found out that 400,000 severely persecuted, martyred, destroyed churches had become over 10 million believers. And that's what God had done in that place. And so the point is, like you say, they were so isolated and so closed off that one of the first questions they asked me is the biggest. I thought they had gathered way too many leaders. And sometime in that process, I thought it's another story that we were getting busted, but not. But they asked me if Jesus had made it to other places, or whether China was the only place Jesus had got to. And I thought, my goodness, what isolation and what faith and how much they needed, and we needed them, they needed us. And so I told them a lot about America, and a lot of little spin-off stories come from that. But I chose to tell them about believers in Saudi Arabia and Somalia. And the wounds are still not healed from watching all those believers martyred in Somalia. And many of those that were some of my best friends. And when I shared that, they've been so vivacious and so open, and hearing their stories, there were a lot of laughter, a lot of singing, and praying and studying the Bible went off late into the night. And they didn't move. They didn't blink. They were totally inscrutable, expressionless. And I thought, well, that was a big hit. And one of the things I don't tell very often, my soul was soaring in these interviews and travel among these believers, but hiding out and sleeping in a bed that's probably a single and a half with 3 other guys for weeks at a time. I don't find that edifying. Having a bad stomach, stepping in a hole thinking I broke an ankle and there's no place I can go for medical care. And I've got all this stuff that's going on internally that's singing with the angels, and yet this shell of my body is just taking a big beating by what we're trying to do. And I just stumbled off that little platform and went in and got into the bed thinking, well, let me grab 30 minutes before the other 3 guys come get in the bed with me, because you wake up at night and you've got an arm across your chest and somebody else is giving you the Abrahamic blessing. That's just not edifying for me. That's not what rednecks do.
Oh, that's good, Nik. Keep going. Sorry, very few people know what that means, but that's funny.
I just let that one out, but I just went to bed. I thought they don't care. And the next morning I hear about 6 a.m. at daylight, I hear all this yelling, screaming like. So I get up thinking, okay, we've been here too long. There's too many of us. They're busted. They're going to go to jail, and I'm going to be taken to the airport, which is usually what they do. You can't make persecution fair. That's something else we have to talk about sometime. But and I went out there, and they're sitting on the ground, men and women, old, young. Dust is flying, and they're pulling their hair, and they're pulling their clothes, and they're beating the ground, and they're crying out. And I thought, well, this is some kind of mass stuff, bad stuff going on. And Jonathan, who's with the Lord now, the interpreter that's out of Taiwan and then out of California, he saw the look on my face and saw my body language, came looking over, and he said, Nik, just Just be quiet and listen to what they're saying. I said, I know absolutely no Chinese. He said, just be quiet. Basically, for once in your life, just be quiet. He took me by the hand, and we're walking among people who don't know down there. And they're crying out to God. They're hitting themselves. And as I'm quiet, I hear Somalia, 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 Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia. And Jonathan looked at me and tears are just streaming down his face. He said, now these are people, 40% of them were in prison at that time. Men, women, from rural places, urban places, highly educated, oral communicators. They were looking at prison as their theological seminary. I have watched how they had been beaten, how they were suffering, and in some cases tortured and killed. And they're yelling out to God for Somalia, Saudi Arabia. And Jonathan said, when you talked last night about the believers who are really persecuted, was their words, they vowed unto God after you went to bed that they would get up an hour early each morning and pray for believers in Somalia and Saudi Arabia until Jesus is made known there. Now we've got the biggest movement of Christianity in persecution in China. The lowest estimates are 85 million. There's significant things going now. Face recognition software and stuff. This is a tough time for the house churches. Again, we'll have to save that up. But I was able to go back months later to Somali believers and to Saudi believers. And I don't want to give your listeners the impression there are a lot of believers in Saudi Arabia. We just don't want to paint targets anywhere. But I went back to them and I said, how things going? They said, well, you can't believe it since you've been gone. The breakthroughs that we've had and the relationships that's been healed and families that have come into the kingdom. I said, yeah, I think I do believe it. There's a movement in China of 10 million people that vowed unto God to pray for you an hour each day. And they just began to weep. And they said, oh God, as if I'm not there. Oh God, let us live long enough to make it to China, to thank those who didn't forget us and who remembered to pray for us when we needed them the most. That's one of the things that the Western Church must remember that Simon of Cyrene carried the cross of Jesus when Jesus could not carry it himself. And through prayer and intervention and fasting, we carry our brothers and sisters in persecution when they can no longer carry themselves. And are we willing today? This is my wife's statement. Are we willing for them to pray for us when it becomes our turn to suffer and be persecuted to the same extent that we're praying for them today? And Ruth will say all the time, there is no such thing as a persecuted church and a church in freedom. There's just the church of Jesus Christ that all day, every day, it's persecuted and it's free, but it belongs to itself.